Over the past 5 years, many social justice campaigns have mobilized around the principle that Black lives matter. By stark contrast, there's the case of the 12 Black women in Boston who were murdered 40 years ago in less than 6 months. Our guest is trying to encourage a closer look at the lives that were lost, using art as a way to confront history and transform it. To tell us about the Estuary Project is its creator, Kendra Hicks. Thank you very much for being with us, Kendra.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, I guess you have some sort of a personal connection to this story, even though the events happened before your time. What kind of connections are we talking about?
Well, I think that there is the neighborhood connection of being a Black woman who comes from Roxbury and the Jamaica Plain neighborhoods that these young women were murdered. But in addition to that, I've spent a lot of my time studying Black feminism, which is how I came to the work of the Combahee River Collective, which is also a collective of women who are local, who are doing a lot of work around these murders.
Now, I vaguely remember from 1979, there were stories about some of the women, and they were small stories. They were not front page stories. Nobody lumped them together and say, my gosh, this is terrible. What were you briefed on as far as what happened with media coverage?
Yeah, I think the Combahee River Collective did lump them together, right? There was a community understanding that there was a reason why the murders were so persistent in those specific communities. But you're right. I think in the mainstream media, there wasn't a lot of coverage of it. I think even I've been working on this for a year. And so even in the time that I've been doing research, I have had to compile a lot of information on my own. Some of the names were misspelled, the dates of the deaths were wrong. And so I had to connect a lot of dots to find out all of the actual information, because even the reporting that was done was not thorough or extensive enough for me to find out the information that I needed.
And I'm sure there must have been this inference at the time, these are not important cases, maybe these are women who had put themselves in harm's way, and
Yeah.
we're not going to make a big deal out of it.
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of that at the beginning. The two young women who were both 15 and 17 were dropouts, and the night that they were found were hanging out with what people would call an unsavory crowd, I suppose. And so the first two murders were seen as one of the newspapers referred to the two young women as women of the night. And so initially there wasn't any attention, but I think that all of the women range from professionals to high school students to young women. One of the women was in the choir at the 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury. And so once people started to see that the women were so different and that they were coming from so many walks of life, and even the age difference was, people started to pay more attention.
And this is not to say their whole families were the same. I mean, I can imagine there are people who are the rough patch of the family for a given period of time. And,
Yeah.
What about getting together with survivors? Have you had some of that going on at some of your installations around the city?
Yeah, I definitely have. I have had the family of Valerie Holland invite me over to their home, and I got to meet not only her siblings, but her extended family. And it was really beautiful to hear about these women from their family's perspective, about all of the things that they were excited about, all of the things that brought them joy before they were taken, but also to hear about the impact that the loss has had on their families. One really, the case of Gwendolyn Yvette Stinson, which was on January 30th. It was the second installation that we had. A family friend actually found us on Facebook and showed up to the installation. And so previously we weren't in contact with her family, and we were able to get in contact with her family. And so now we're in contact with her immediate family, her extended family, and you're able to have those conversations and have them tell the story. They are able to tell their own story.
What does that do for the people who are having those conversations?
The family members, you mean?
Yes.
I think for some people, it brings up the difficult memories of losing their family member. But what I've heard from all of the families is gratitude, because they felt like their family member was forgotten. They weren't highlighted. Nobody talked about them. A supermajority of the murders went unsolved. And so a lot of people feel this sense of justice being done, if only by way of remembering them, that makes them feel like people, like they didn't go unnoticed, like the loss didn't go unnoticed.
I want to ask you about some of the installations. There was one where you see these fluffy, multicolored balls. It almost looks festive. Explain that one.
Yeah. So actually, what you're looking at, and they do look like round, but they're actually carnation flowers. And so the installations all feature the carnation flowers. And the reason for that is because I wanted to kind of make a nod at things that grow in unusual places. And so flowers are something that are typically so beautiful and that when they bloom and we don't see them in those places. And I wanted to really present that beauty and I wanted to present that festivity in these places where these lives were lost. But ultimately the flowers are supposed to represent the new world. And so you'll see in some of the photos that there's a lettering that says that there's a new world coming. And the flowers are meant to represent that new world. And that's why they're bursting out from the cracks in the floor. And that's why they're overtaking everything that they see, because my belief is that we're going to build a new world and it's going to come and it's going to consume everything in a really beautiful way.
I also remember one of the shots, things that were placed on a table, people gathered around the table as well. What did you put there?
There's an altar table for each of the women. And so I've been doing a close work with a local healer, Lanice Colong, and she has been creating altars to honor the women and to remember them, but also to create ritual around their deaths. And so there's candles, there's information about them on there, and there's places where people can leave offerings and really honor the women. So each of the installations is actually launched by a ceremony every morning at 9 a.m. where people can come and join.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Kendra Hicks from the Estuary Project. Kendra, we're used to hearing now that when somebody survives an act of violence, especially murder, there's trauma and it can last for a long time. Do some of these survivors still feel it, you think?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I've had some of the stories of the families and the impact that it's had on some of the family members that till this day they're still struggling with the loss. I think that trauma, particularly if it's not taken care of or like taken care of and like nurtured in that moment, it takes a really long time to heal from. And I'm thinking where we are now in 2019, particularly in the city of Boston, where there's a lot of conversation about trauma-informed and healing from trauma. And in 1979, there wasn't necessarily that same language or even that same orientation to violence. And so you can see the impact in some of the families still till this day of the loss.
You know, we have cases like this that still happen, and I think nowadays we look at the person who was killed more closely and we see their potential and we feel their value. If we do that more often, what are the consequences, you think?
Well, I think for me, that's at the core of the project, right? That to me, I feel like remembering what our community has not only experienced but survived is actually what gives us the audacity to imagine a new world, right? It kind of gives, it creates a launching pad for our imaginations and for really building and sculpting what our world can look like. And so for me, remembering is the first part. If we continue to remember who we are, where we came from, the things that our communities have experienced and has remembered, I think that gives us more time to envision a new world.
I'm also thinking here like a detective story reader. Did you find anything about what happened to the victims, or at least around the investigations about, you know, maybe why the investigations didn't solve the crimes?
Yeah, I think there was very little. There was some information there around some of the people who were convicted, some of the men who were convicted, but ultimately there wasn't a lot of information. Some people were like, you know, they were found somewhere in an alley and there was nobody there and nobody would know why or what could have happened to these women. But ultimately, you know, the Combahee River Collective was really calling attention to the fact that Black women were being treated as disposable, and that's what was allowing the murders to continue. That it was not only the people who were murdering these women, but it was the systemic issue that was causing the murders, right? It was the way that systemic oppression was actually showing up in the world was allowing for these women to die.
When you say systemic, what do you think of, especially in Boston?
Systemic racism in particular. I think that there's a lot of conversation about the Combahee River Collective and intersectionality. And so we talk about how people's identities and identity politics kind of impact the way that they walk in the world. And so when you think about Black women who lived in Roxbury, they were experiencing a specific kind of oppression, particularly the way that they were navigating the school systems and hospitals, the police department. It shows up pretty much everywhere.
I think if these murders had taken place over the past year, I think if nothing else, there would have been a huge uproar from the community in Boston. I don't remember it all coming together like that 40 years ago. Have things changed, would you say?
Well, there was definitely a concerted effort from the community 40 years ago. There was a lot of organizations, women's organizations that were born out of the murders. There was a lot of people in the community who were organizing, even some mothers of the women who marched on City Hall to ask for answers. And so there was definitely a response. I think the example that I want to bring up about these is that there were actually 11 Black women who were murdered. And the 12th woman who was murdered during this time period was actually a white woman. And it was also the only murder that got national attention. And so even in who gets the attention nationally or in the news, you can see it here in the murder in that way. And so I do think that some things have shifted, but I think that a lot of it is still the same.
And on the other hand, compared with almost 10 years later, there's the Stewart case when a white woman was murdered in the Mission Hill part of Roxbury. I remember the front page in the Globe. It was like, the end of civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were going into Black and brown neighborhoods and turning the neighborhoods upside down, looking for this person who didn't exist. And I think that that is a real testament to how systemic oppression creates narratives that then people believe and then people implement, right? It made it so easy. The conditions that people of color were living in the city and the way that they were being treated and our own beliefs about people of color were really making it so easy for people to believe his story and for it to kind of develop into what it did.
Kendra, your installation is still a work in progress. You're also trying to raise some money for it. So if people want to learn more, help out, what's the best thing for them to do?
They can visit the estuaryprojects.com. We have our next installation on February 21st, and the installations will be going until May 7th.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kendra Hicks from the Estuary Project.